In the dead of night, the CIA launched a secret plan to remove Africa's youngest leader, Ibrahim Traoré. They believed their operation would stay hidden, their betrayal buried in silence. But then, the truth leaked. What followed shocked the world and turned a small nation into the epicenter of defiance. This is the story of how a plot to destroy Traoré backfired and sparked a fire across Africa. Stay with us to the end. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories they never want you to hear. The corridors of power do not echo with noise. They whisper. They vibrate with the hum of fluorescent lights, the static crackle of encrypted radio signals, the rustle of paper stamped classified and slid across polished tables under watchful eyes. Inside Langley, Virginia, the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, there is no daylight, only endless rows of sterile offices, computer screens glowing with maps of the world, and men and women who believe they hold the fate of nations in their hands. On this night, the world's gaze was elsewhere. On Wall Street numbers, Middle Eastern negotiations, the growing tension in Asia. But deep inside the CIA, all eyes had turned to a small landlocked country in West Africa, Burkina Faso. On their screens, the face of a young man stared back at them. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. A soldier-turned-leader, clad in a red beret that evoked memories the West had hoped to bury. The memory of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who once defied imperial powers and paid with his life. The CIA operatives studied him as though dissecting a threat. His speeches, his policies, his growing influence, his refusal to bow to France, his rejection of IMF dictates, his alliances that looked east instead of west. To some in Washington, Traoré was a nuisance. To others, he was a contagion, a spark that could ignite the dry grass of African resistance and set the entire continent aflame. In the dimly lit Situation Room where the CIA's Africa desk had gathered, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken truth. Traoré had to be stopped. On the table lay a dossier thicker than most presidential briefings. Inside, satellite photographs of gold mines, intercepted communications from Ouagadougou, reports of villagers rallying behind their young leader, intelligence on militias loyal to him, and a chilling projection prepared by analysts. If left unchecked, Traoré's influence may catalyze a continental movement against Western interests. Estimated time frame, less than 5 years. The words alone were enough to make the air in the room feel like lead. An officer stamped the front page with a single word in red ink, threat. And so began Operation Shadow Dune, a clandestine mission designed not for the public eye, not for the headlines, but for the hidden machinery that had long manipulated the fates of nations. A plan forged in silence, sharpened in secrecy, and meant to unfold without a trace. But Ibrahim Traoré's story could not be confined to a file in Langley. Far away, under the burning Sahelian sun, his people were living through hunger and hardship. Fields cracked by drought, markets empty, children's ribs showing through torn shirts. Every statistic in the CIA's report translated into human suffering on the ground. But the same suffering had hardened Traoré. It was why he refused the dictates of those who once enslaved Africa with debt, why he dared to call out the hypocrisy of nations that preached freedom but practiced plunder. And this defiance, this refusal to kneel, was what made him dangerous. The CIA knew that a bullet alone could not silence him. It would only make him a martyr, another Sankara whose ghost would haunt the West for decades. No, this operation would need precision. It would need shadows, whispers, invisible strings pulling the ground from beneath him until he collapsed under the weight of orchestrated chaos. The plan was simple on paper. Infiltrate, destabilize, discredit. First, propaganda. Flood the airwaves with stories portraying Traoré as a dictator, a reckless soldier out of his depth, a pawn of foreign powers. Second, infiltration. Buy off his generals, arm militias in the north, fund opposition groups under the guise of humanitarian aid. Third, economic strangulation, push for sanctions, pressure regional bodies, cut off international trade. The final stage, if needed, a coup dressed as a domestic uprising, leaving no fingerprints, no trails leading back to Langley. In Washington's eyes, this was routine. They had done it in Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, before. Leaders had risen, resisted, and fallen, all under the weight of hidden hands pulling levers from thousands of miles away. Why should Traoré be any different? But the truth was, he was different. At 30-something. He was younger than most of the men who sat in air-conditioned offices plotting his downfall. He had no Swiss bank accounts, no mansions in Europe, no offshore safety net to run to. He had only his country, his soldiers, and his people, many of whom were so poor they had nothing left to lose. And that made him more dangerous than any wealth-backed leader, because a man with nothing to lose is a man who cannot be bought, cannot be bribed, cannot be broken. The CIA didn't understand this yet. They believed power was measured in dollars, weapons, satellites, and influence. They did not see the power in a barefoot child chanting Traoré's name in a dusty village, or the old women who raised their fists when he promised a future free of foreign chains. They did not understand that in the cracks of desperation, hope had begun to bloom. And hope is harder to kill than any man. The first moves of Operation Shadow Dune unfolded like clockwork. Propaganda trickled into international media. Headlines painted Traoré as unstable, dangerous, a threat to democracy. Think tanks in Washington published reports warning of rising authoritarianism in Burkina Faso. Well-funded NGOs suddenly began releasing surveys suggesting declining public support for his leadership. The machinery of narrative was turning, grinding away, reshaping global perception. Meanwhile, in the deserts of northern Burkina Faso, unmarked crates arrived under the cover of night. Inside, weapons, smuggled in through third countries, distributed to mercenaries whose allegiance could be bought for cash. General after general received offers cloaked in secrecy, wealth, power, escape routes, if they turned against Traoré at the right time. And in quiet conference rooms in regional capitals, Western diplomats whispered of sanctions, of trade suspensions, of frozen assets. Pressure designed to strangle a fragile economy until the people themselves demanded Traoré's removal. On paper, it was perfect. But shadows have a way of leaking into the light. Somewhere within this machinery, a crack appeared. It was not in Langley, not in Washington, not in the shadowy networks of mercenaries or the polished halls of diplomacy. It appeared in a place far more dangerous. Inside the operation itself. One operative, tasked with gathering intelligence on Traoré's inner circle, began to doubt. He had seen the hunger in the villages, the despair in the eyes of children, the desperation of mothers. He had read the CIA reports calling these people expendable variables in a geopolitical chess game. And something inside him broke. Late at night, on a secure line meant only for official updates, he began copying files. Dossiers stamped top secret, lists of generals marked for bribery, photographs of weapons caches, plans detailing how propaganda would be seeded into international outlets. Slowly, quietly, dangerously, he began to leak. At first, only whispers reached certain journalists. Anonymous emails, encrypted messages, fragments of documents. But like sparks in dry grass, the whispers began to spread. And though the CIA still believed their plan was airtight, though they still believed Traoré's fall was inevitable, the truth was already slipping beyond their control. Because truth, once set free, cannot be caged. And the truth was this: the most powerful intelligence agency in the world had turned its full machinery against a single young African leader. And they were terrified of him. Act 1 closes here, not with the fall of Ibrahim Traoré, not with the triumph of the CIA, but with the unseen crack in their carefully constructed machine. The narration leaves us with the image of two worlds in Langley. Men in suits stand over a glowing map of Burkina Faso, convinced they are gods pulling the strings of destiny. In Africa, Ibrahim Traoré walks through a crowd of his people, their hands reaching for him, their eyes filled with something stronger than fear, faith. And somewhere in the shadows, on a server not yet traced, a file is uploading. A file that will tear open the veil of secrecy, shatter the illusion of control, and send shockwaves through the world. The CIA believed they had built an unbreakable machine. But what they never expected was that the truth itself would become the weapon that turned against them. And what happened next shocked the world. The desert is a graveyard of forgotten empires, broken forts, rusted weapons, the bleached bones of those who marched under banners that promised eternity. Yet empires fall, and the sand covers their memory. Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than most. He had grown up in the Sahel, where history is not something written in libraries, but etched into the earth itself, where every grain of dust seemed to whisper of conquerors who once believed they would rule forever. He had watched his own country, Burkina Faso, suffer under cycles of corruption and dependency. He had seen villages left to starve while the nation's gold flowed outward to foreign banks. He had seen the dreams of Thomas Sankara crushed by bullets fired in the name of stability. And as a young officer, he had sworn silently that, if ever given the chance, he would not bow. He would not let history repeat itself. That chance came sooner than he could have imagined. A wave of discontent, a tide of disillusioned soldiers and angry civilians lifted him into power. To the west, it looked sudden, chaotic, reckless. To his people, it looked like salvation. But the throne he took was not gilded. It was made of fire. The weight of hunger across Burkina Faso, famine gnawed at the edges of survival. Markets were empty. Mothers sold the last of their jewelry for a handful of rice, and children went to sleep with nothing but water in their stomachs. Every week brought reports of villages abandoned, families migrating in search of food, livestock collapsing. In the heat, international aid had once flowed in, but always with strings. Loans disguised as lifelines, donations packaged with political conditions. The IMF's demands were endless: privatize water, open markets, sell resources at prices set by outsiders. Each agreement signed was another chain locked around the nation's neck. Traoré looked at the numbers on paper and saw not economics but death sentences. He rejected new loans. He cut ties that drained more than they gave. He told his people, "We will eat from our soil. We will drink from our wells. We will live by our own hands." The West called him reckless. The people called him brave. But the CIA watched with growing alarm. A leader who rejected IMF dictates was one thing. A leader who inspired his neighbors to follow was another. And Traoré's speeches were spreading, translated, on social media, whispered in villages across Mali, Niger, Guinea. Each time he spoke, the embers of Sankara's ghost seemed to glow brighter. A legacy revived. For years, Thomas Sankara had been little more than a name in textbooks, a black and white photograph fading in memory. But under Traoré, murals began to appear on crumbling walls, paintings of Sankara on motorbikes, fists raised, slogans of dignity and independence scrawled in bold colors. Young men wore his image on t-shirts. Old women told stories of the days when Burkina Faso was proud, when the people stood tall. The CIA took note. In their files, Sankara's legacy was a contagion risk, proof that one man's defiance could ripple across generations. Traoré was now tapping into that contagion. He was resurrecting a ghost the West had buried, and in doing so, he was becoming a ghost himself. An idea more than a man. And ideas are far harder to kill. Inside Langley, analysts drew comparisons. They studied case files of leaders once toppled by covert operations. But something about Traoré did not fit the pattern. He was not isolated. He was not dependent. His power came not from elites, but from villages, soldiers, mothers, and youth. And that made the threat more volatile. Operation Shadow Dune deepened still. The CIA believed in its machinery. They had toppled governments more stable, more resourceful, more entrenched. Why not this one? Operation Shadow Dune expanded in silence. Money flowed into offshore accounts belonging to Burkina Faso generals. Anonymous weapons shipments slipped across borders. Rebels trained under the cover of night, their faces hidden behind scarves, their rifles marked only by dust. Propaganda intensified. International outlets began describing Burkina Faso as a dictatorship in the making. Reports of corruption circulated, unverified but repeated until they became truth. Western diplomats warned that Traoré was dragging his country into ruin. But there was one problem. The people didn't believe it. In the markets, in the villages, in the army barracks, the stories rang hollow. The people compared propaganda with the reality they lived. A leader who walked among them, who ate their food, who slept on the ground with soldiers, who spoke not in polished rhetoric, but in the language of their struggle. Each lie spread by. The CIA seemed only to strengthen his legitimacy. Each headline condemning him became proof that he was indeed defying the oppressors. Shadow Dune was working in reverse. Though Langley did not yet realize it, the generals packed among Traoré's inner circle, however, cracks were forming. Not every general shared his vision of independence. Some had grown comfortable with Western aid, foreign trips, quiet deals that brought wealth into their pockets. These men were the perfect recruits for Shadow Dune. One by one, they were approached. First, a dinner invitation in a neighboring capital. Then, an unmarked envelope. Promises whispered in hotel rooms. The deals were simple. When the moment came, they would step aside, or strike. In return, they would be rewarded with wealth. Immunity and power. Three generals in particular became the pillars of the CIA's plan. Their loyalty to Traoré was already waning. Now, with foreign money in their hands and promises of safety for their families, they began to conspire. But betrayal is never clean. It leaks. It drips like water through cracks in stone. And as the generals whispered in secret, loyal soldiers began to take note. Shadows moved within shadows. Suspicion grew. Traoré himself, though young, was no fool. He had risen to power. By sensing betrayal, by acting swiftly when others hesitated. He saw the shifting eyes, the half-truths, the sudden wealth of men who claimed poverty. He did not yet know the scale of the plot against him, but he knew the walls were closing in. The people's suffering. Meanwhile, sanctions began to bite. Fuel prices soared. Food imports stalled. Medicines vanished from shelves. Hospitals filled. With the sick, children gasped for breath, and mothers wept in silence. The weight of invisible hands pressing down on the economy was suffocating. International news framed the crisis as Traoré's fault. But the people saw differently. They knew where the pressure came from. They saw foreign powers wielding hunger as a weapon, strangling them in order to break their leader. And instead of turning against him, they turned against those outside forces. Protests erupted, not against Traoré, but against the West. Crowds filled Ouagadougou's streets chanting, "Leave Africa alone." The more the CIA tried to starve them into submission, the louder the voices grew. In the Sahel, a dangerous equation was forming. Suffering multiplied by hope equals resistance. The first leak. It was at this fragile moment that the first true crack in Shadow Dune became visible. A journalist in Europe received a package. Inside, a flash drive. No return address, no explanation. Just one phrase written on paper. Truth must breathe. On the drive were documents, classified memos detailing CIA involvement in West Africa. Nothing conclusive yet, just fragments. Mentions of asset recruitment, notes on regional destabilization, coded references to payments. Enough to raise suspicion, not yet enough to convict. The journalist hesitated. To publish meant risking career, reputation, safety. But the temptation was too great. An article appeared online days later. Sources suggest covert Western interference in Burkina Faso. It was quickly dismissed as conspiracy theory, drowned out by official statements. But the seed was planted. And like all seeds, given time, it would grow. The CIA's blind spot inside Langley. Officials celebrated early signs of pressure. Economists predicted Burkina Faso's collapse within months. Analysts claimed disinformation was gaining traction. The bribed generals reported readiness. To the agency, all indicators pointed to success. But they had a blind spot. They underestimated the power of memory. For decades, Africans had been told their leaders fell because they were corrupt, incompetent, weak. But now, with every whisper of foreign interference, the narrative shifted. Traoré was not failing, he was being attacked. And if he was being attacked by the West, it meant he was dangerous to their control. And if he was dangerous to their control, it meant he was the right man to follow. The CIA had intended to break him. Instead, they were making him a legend. The shadow of what's coming as Act 2 draws to a close. The tension sharpens. Traoré walks among his people, feeling both their love and their suffering. He knows betrayal is near, but not yet where. He knows foreign hands are against him, but not yet how deep their reach goes. In Langley, the architects of Shadow Dune believe they are weeks away from success. They do not see the leak that has already escaped. They do not hear the whispers spreading in cafes, in markets, on social media. They do not realize the truth is already bleeding out of their control. And in the shadows of Burkina Faso, 3 generals polish their betrayal, waiting for the signal that will set the coup in motion. But the stage is no longer theirs alone. Unseen forces are moving, documents are spreading, the truth is stirring. And soon, it will break through the walls of secrecy with a force greater than any weapon the CIA has ever known. The desert night does not sleep, it breathes. Winds carry the echoes of voices long silenced, and in the silence between gunshots and prayer calls, secrets find their way into the world. Burkina Faso was becoming a land where every whisper carried the weight of destiny. The CIA believed they were orchestrating a symphony of shadows, yet the music was beginning to slip out of their control. The fire of disinformation, news articles multiplied like weeds. International headlines described Traoré as a reckless military strongman, an erratic populist leading his nation into ruin. Think tanks in Washington warned of regional instability. French commentators sneered about Burkina Faso's descent into chaos. Inside Ouagadougou, rumors spread in tandem that Traoré had sold the country to Russia, that he was plotting to crown himself as king, that he was siphoning gold into private accounts. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. In the Wawa game of disinformation, repetition is enough. But what the CIA hadn't anticipated was the counter-narrative. Burkina youth, armed with smartphones and determination, began fighting back online. They flooded platforms with videos of Traoré visiting villages, eating with farmers, standing in the dust with soldiers. They exposed the contradictions in Western media reports, mocked false headlines, and demanded answers. Why, they asked, is the West more afraid of our leader than of our poverty? Each post, each video, each shared message became a counterweight to the narrative machine. And slowly, the propaganda designed to weaken Traoré was instead galvanizing a generation. Betrayal in the ranks still. The most dangerous threat was not outside. It was within. The 3 generals bribed under Operation Shadow Dune were no longer hiding their ambitions. They whispered in back rooms, promised their allies power, and waited for the perfect moment. The CIA funneled money through shell companies, ensuring the generals could recruit loyal officers, stockpile weapons, and plan a coup with precision. Traoré suspected betrayal, but the full shape of it eluded him. He read the faces of his men, like maps, tracing lines of loyalty and doubt. Some soldiers stood tall with conviction. Others shifted under his gaze, their silence louder than words. Trust became a currency more fragile than gold. The villages. Suffer meanwhile, the people bore the weight of sanctions. Markets, once bustling with food, now echoed with emptiness. Women walked miles for water, only to return with muddy buckets. Hospitals rationed medicine, turning away the sick when supplies ran out. Children carried the fatigue of hunger in their bones. The West framed this suffering as evidence of Traoré's failure, but the people saw through the lie. They understood the invisible hands at play. They want us to starve, one mother whispered, so we will betray him. But we will not. Out of hunger grew defiance. Communities organized food sharing. Networks. Farmers traded crops directly with neighbors instead of markets. Villages protected supply routes against sabotage. The harder the world pressed down, the stronger their resilience became. The CIA had underestimated the stubbornness of the human spirit. The leak explodes, and then, like a spark in dry grass, the leak returned. This time, it was not fragments. It was not whispers. It was fire. An anonymous file appeared on secure servers used by investigative journalists across Europe and Africa. Inside, internal CIA documents, meeting minutes, payment records, photographs of generals receiving bribes, satellite images of weapons shipments. The file was massive, detailed, undeniable. Headlines erupted. Leaked files suggest CIA covert operation against Burkina Faso leader. Governments scrambled to deny it. Spokespersons called it fabrication. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Bank transfers matched, names aligned, photographs too precise to dismiss. And then came the most damning revelation. The codename Operation Shadow Dune was explicitly mentioned in the documents. Across Africa, outrage ignited. Leaders who had remained silent now spoke of neo-colonial aggression. Crowds poured into the streets chanting, "Down with foreign puppets! Traoré is Africa." For the first time in decades, Africans saw proof, not speculation, not rumor, but proof, that their suffering was not simply the result of incompetence, but of deliberate sabotage. And when truth becomes visible, it transforms. From idea into weapon. CIA panic inside Langley. Alarms went off. Not literal sirens, but the panicked rush of damage control. Officials demanded investigations. Who leaked? How much had escaped? Could the documents be discredited? Analysts scoured for suspects, but the leak's precision suggested an insider too close to the core. Trust within the agency fractured. Meetings grew tense. Paranoia spread like a contagion. But outside their walls, the narrative had already slipped beyond their reach. The more they denied, the more guilty they looked. The machine of secrecy was collapsing under its own weight. The coup approaches. Still, the CIA pushed forward. The generals had already been paid, weapons delivered, orders drafted. Denial campaigns would buy time. All they needed was a single decisive strike. The plan was simple. Stage a coup, declare Traoré's removal as the will of the people, and present it as internal instability unrelated to the CIA. The leak had complicated matters, but not destroyed them. If Traoré fell quickly, the world would move on. In Ouagadougou, shadows gathered. Mercenaries slipped into position. Generals sharpened their betrayal. Soldiers loyal to them waited for the signal. The city braced for something it could not, yet named the people's stand. But something else was happening. Ordinary villagers, armed with little more than machetes and resolve, began traveling toward the capital. They had heard of the coup whispers, the betrayal, the plots. They refused to let their leader fall without resistance. By the thousands, they marched. Farmers, traders, mothers with children on their backs, youth carrying flags. They filled roads, camped in fields, and sang songs of defiance under the stars. When the CIA had envisioned this moment, they imagined Traoré isolated, abandoned, betrayed. What they had not imagined was a human wall rising around him, flesh and blood against bullets and lies. The edge of collapse. By the final days of Act 3, Burkina Faso teetered on the edge. Inside military compounds, generals plotted with maps and timetables. In hidden rooms, CIA operatives wired encrypted messages. In crowded villages, people prepared for the fight of their lives. And Ibrahim Traoré, standing in the presidential compound, felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He knew a storm was coming. He knew betrayal was close. He knew his country stood at the brink of destruction, or liberation. But above all, he knew one truth. The CIA had unleashed their plan with precision. But in doing so, they had also unleashed the one thing they could never control, the truth itself. And as truth spread like wildfire, the world was about to witness a confrontation that would shatter illusions, expose hidden hands, and change the balance of power forever. The coup ignites. The night fell heavy over Ouagadougou. The air was thick, as though the city itself could sense the weight of what was coming. Silence gripped the streets, but it was not peace. It was the silence of anticipation, the stillness before thunder. In hidden barracks across the capital, soldiers whispered oaths to their generals. Trucks loaded with weapons were parked in shadows, their engines cooled but ready. Maps lay unfolded under dim light, red circles marking key targets: the radio station, the airport, the presidential compound. The generals, once sworn protectors of Burkina Faso, now moved like predators stalking prey. Their betrayal was sharpened into a blade, ready to cut through the heart of the nation. And behind them, unseen but present, the hands of the CIA guided every step. The signal midnight. A coded message pulsed across encrypted lines. Shadow Dune begins. Engines roared to life. Soldiers in stolen uniforms rolled into the streets. Columns of trucks moved toward the city's arteries. The coup had begun. Their first target: silence the voice of the people. The state radio station, where nightly broadcasts carried news of Traoré's speeches and patriotic songs, was stormed by masked men. Guns clattered against the floor. Journalists were forced to the ground. Within minutes, static replaced music. Second target: the skies. At Ouagadougou's modest airport, armed units seized control of the runway tower. Flights were halted, communications cut. Escape routes sealed. Third target: the presidency. But here, The general's perfect script began to unravel. The human shield word spread faster than trucks could move. A guard loyal to Traore sent a single text message to a friend, who shouted it to neighbors, who relayed it to the streets. By the time the first armored vehicles turned toward the presidential compound, the city was already moving. Crowds surged from alleys and markets, barefoot men, mothers clutching children, youth waving flags. They carried no rifles, no armor, only machetes, drums, and their own voices. "You will not take him," they cried, like a tide. They poured around the compound, forming a living wall of flesh and will. The generals had prepared for soldiers. They had prepared for resistance. But they had not prepared for tens of thousands of unarmed citizens willing to die before letting their leader fall. The trucks halted. Soldiers inside shifted uneasily. Orders clashed with conscience. To fire meant mowing down their own people. To hesitate meant betraying their generals. The coup's precision began to fracture. Traoré's stand inside the compound. Ibrahim Traoré stood calm, his hands behind his back, his face lit only by the glow of lanterns. Reports rushed in. The radio silenced, the airport seized, the people outside forming a wall. He listened quietly, then spoke. "They think power belongs to shadows. Tonight, we show them it belongs to the people." He refused to flee, refused to hide. Instead, he walked to the balcony overlooking the crowds. The people roared at the sight of him, their chants swelling like thunder. "Traoré! Traoré! Burkina! Africa!" For a moment, the coup faltered. Soldiers aiming rifles lowered them, shaken by the sheer force of human will. The leak erupts, and then, like lightning striking at the exact moment of the storm, the leak resurfaced. As coup units scrambled through the city, international news networks broke a new wave of documents. Live broadcasts displayed CIA payment, orders, intercepted audio of American officials coordinating with generals, even drone images of secret meetings. The narrative collapsed in real time. African leaders watching from their capitals saw not a domestic coup but a foreign plot exposed in the act. Social media exploded with fury. Hashtags spread like wildfire. #hands off Burkina, #Africa for Africans. The world was watching, and the general's justification crumbled before it could be spoken. Betrayal revealed. Inside one of the commandeered trucks, a young soldier turned to his commander and spat, "You sold us for dollars." The commander tried to deny it, but his phone betrayed him. A notification pinged with encrypted instructions, traced back to offshore accounts. The soldier ripped the phone from his hand, threw it onto the street, and stepped out of the truck. Others followed. Defections began, small at first, then growing. Columns split apart, units broke rank, and soon the coup soldiers were no longer an army, but fragments of one. The CIA's carefully orchestrated operation was dissolving under the acid of truth. The showdown, but the three generals pressed forward, desperate, cornered by their own betrayal. One unit reached the presidential gates. Gunfire cracked the night. Citizens screamed, scattered, then regrouped, throwing themselves in front of armored vehicles. Stones clattered against steel. Traoré ordered no retreat. Instead, he walked out among the people, unarmed, exposed. His very presence was a weapon stronger than any rifle. The generals, watching from their convoy, faced a choice: advance and kill thousands before the world's cameras, or retreat and admit failure. They chose neither. Instead, they demanded Traoré be handed over, alive. But the crowd answered first. A roar shook the ground. "Over our dead bodies!" Collapse in Langley, the CIA's operations center fell into chaos. Screens flickered with live feeds of collapsing units, defections, and endless waves of people surrounding Traoré. Analysts shouted conflicting reports. Some urged escalation, others withdrawal. But the truth was undeniable. The coup had not only failed, it had turned against them. The leaked documents, the defections, the human shield of citizens, all converged into a single catastrophic outcome. The operation had been exposed, live, irreversible. The generals fled into the night, their own soldiers abandoning them. Trucks burned on the roadside. Weapons were seized by villagers. The city, instead of falling, rose. And in the center of it, Ibrahim Traoré stood unmoved, the storm swirling around him yet unable to break him. The moment as dawn broke, Ouagadougou was unrecognizable. Smoke rose from abandoned vehicles, but the compound still stood. The people, exhausted but victorious, filled the streets in song. Traore stepped forward once more, his voice carried by loudspeakers, his words etched into the marrow of history. They came in shadows, but we stood in the light. Let this be the day Africa learns. No empire can break a people who refuse to kneel. The crowd erupted. Not just Burkina Faso, but across Africa. Millions watching from phones and televisions rose with him. The coup was dead. The CIA's hands were burned, and history had turned. Dawn over. Ouagadougou. When the sun rose over Burkina Faso, the city did not look defeated. It looked reborn. The smoke of burnt trucks curled into the morning sky. But beneath it, tens of thousands of citizens sang in unison. Their chants carried, not fear, but victory. A chorus that had defied bullets, betrayal, and the weight of empires. The coup had failed. The generals were gone, fleeing into exile or hiding in shadows that no longer sheltered them. Soldiers once bought with bribes now stood with their people, ashamed but redeemed. And in the heart of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, no longer just a captain, no longer just a leader, but a symbol. The collapse of shadows in Washington, Langley, and Paris, panic reigned. Reports flowed in like torrents of acid, leaked documents verified, coup leaders defected, citizens forming human walls broadcast across the globe. Every denial rang hollow.
Every statement exposed itself as theatre. Foreign ministries scrambled to issue carefully worded responses, pretending neutrality, calling for stability, but their words carried no weight. The mask had been ripped away. The world saw the
strings and worse. They saw who held them. For decades, coups in Africa had been painted as local instability. But now, with the CIA's fingerprints exposed, the old excuse was shattered. The empire had been caught red-handed. The people rise. Across Africa, something stirred. In Mali, Niger, Chad, and beyond, crowds flooded the streets in solidarity with Burkina Faso. Protesters waved flags with Traoré's face. Youth shouted slogans not only for their nation but for the continent. No more puppets. Africa for Africans. Down with foreign hands. What began as a battle in one small nation became a spark for an entire continent. For too long, Africa had been told its destiny was written by others, by IMF contracts, by World Bank dictates, by foreign soldiers on its soil. But now, with the collapse of Operation Shadow Dune, they saw something else. That destiny could be seized, reshaped, reclaimed. And all of it carried one name, Traoré. The generals' fall. The three generals who had betrayed their oath did not escape judgment. One was captured at the border by villagers who recognized his face from leaked photographs. They dragged him back, not to be executed, but to be paraded before the people he betrayed. His silence spoke louder than confession. Another fled to a European embassy, begging for asylum. But even behind fortified walls, he was a prisoner of shame, his name forever cursed in his homeland. The third disappeared into the desert, his convoy scattered, his men abandoning him. Legends say he was last seen wandering, lost among the dunes he once believed he commanded. Their power evaporated, like mist under sunlight. Their legacy became a warning etched into history. Betrayal has no refuge when truth is revealed. The CIA's reckoning. For the CIA, the operation was more than a failure. It was a humiliation. Internal investigations tore through the agency like fire. Careers ended overnight. Files were shredded, names erased, but the stain remained. Congressional hearings in Washington demanded answers. How, senators asked, did a superpower lose control to one of the poorest nations on Earth? There was no answer that satisfied. The truth was simple, yet devastating. They underestimated the people. All the satellites, drones, payments, and plots collapsed against one force they could not infiltrate, could not bribe, could not defeat. Unity. Traoré's transformation. And what of Ibrahim Traoré? He stood not as a man basking in victory, but as one burdened with new responsibility. He knew this moment was larger than him, larger than Burkina Faso. The eyes of Africa now looked to him as proof that resistance was possible, that dignity could be defended. He traveled to villages, not as a distant ruler but as a son returning home. He ate with farmers in their fields, sat with mothers in their courtyards, listened to elders recount their struggles. Everywhere he went, the same words followed. You did not bend, and because of you, neither will we. He became more than a leader. He became a symbol, a living reminder that courage in one place could ignite courage everywhere. Africa awakens. The ripple spread further still. African leaders, once silent, began to speak. They questioned foreign military bases on their soil. They renegotiated unfair contracts. They demanded respect, not as clients but as equals. And at the grassroots, the people pushed harder. Youth movements multiplied, demanding accountability, dignity, sovereignty. In classrooms, students debated their continent's future not as dream, but as possibility. For the first time in generations, the idea of a free Africa felt tangible. Within reach. The world watches the West, stunned by its failure, recalibrated. Some pushed for harsher sanctions, hoping to strangle what bullets could not kill. Others urged diplomacy, fearing that further pressure would only ignite more defiance. Meanwhile, common new alliances formed. African nations once divided began discussing trade without intermediaries, security without foreign troops, futures without permission. The global balance had shifted. And it had shifted not through warplanes or parliaments, but through the unbreakable will of ordinary people standing with their leader. The lesson of shadows, as the dust of history settled. One truth remained clear. The CIA had moved in shadows, believing secrecy was invincible. But shadows dissolve when exposed to light. The leak had undone decades of silent control, and the people of Burkina Faso had refused to kneel. The operation meant to crush Ibrahim Traoré had instead elevated him into legend. And so the question spread across Africa, whispered in villages and shouted in cities. If Burkina Faso can stand, why not us? Epilogue. The question that remains years from now, historians would write of this moment. They would debate its origins, its causes, its consequences. Some would call it the spark of Africa's second liberation. Others would call it a turning point in global politics. But for those who lived it, who stood in the streets as bullets threatened and truth prevailed, it was something simpler, something deeper. It was proof. Proof that power is not eternal. Proof that betrayal can be unmasked. Proof that no empire, however vast, can break a people who rise as one. And so the story ends not with an answer, but with a question. The very question Traoré himself asked. As he stood before the jubilant crowd, his voice steady, his eyes blazing with conviction. Is this the moment Africa broke its chains?